I moved to Calgary in 2000 and spent 10 years there. And one of my early observations was that Calgarians, at least, but I think Albertans generally, were a lot less conservative than they were supposed to be. I found them actually, many of them, quite moderate and very much like Canadians in other provinces. Well, I'm going to be talking to David Coletto, who is the president and CEO of Abacus Data, because he has data that backs that up. So welcome to the interview, David.
Great to see you, Markham.
Likewise. Give me sort of generally walk us through what your data says about the political views that Albertans hold and how they sort of sit relative to what other Canadians in other provinces believe.
Yeah, so we did a survey just in December of last year, a big national survey, and did a large oversample, as we say in research terms, in Alberta. So we can make that comparison with pretty good confidence. And when you ask Canadians and Albertans questions like, do you think the government should ensure that everybody has a certain standard of living, or it's better if decisions are made right at the grassroots level as opposed to an elite level? Do you believe climate change is a serious issue? Do you believe that Christian values should be at the center of decision making? On a range of ideological and policy questions, the gap between Albertans and the rest of the country is actually quite small, right? So on paper, Albertans really reflect the same sensibilities and views as Canadians in other parts of the countries, and the urban-rural divide are similar than if you look in Ontario on those kinds of questions. But what differentiates Albertans, I think, is their political culture, is their identity, right? And so you can answer questions in a survey that might position you as a country, as a jurisdiction, as generally moderate, right, or as moderate as any other province, but yet your voting behavior is so different, right? Overwhelmingly voting for the federal Conservatives, historically, anyways, overwhelmingly voting for a conservative provincial government. What gives? And what gives is that political culture and identity that really is tied to the conservative or small c conservative political movements, and some of the resistance to issues like climate change, energy transition, and so on, because of the importance of the oil and gas sector to that identity.
Now, I've interviewed other pollsters, David, who have said that Albertans are oil and gas. It doesn't matter where you sit on the political spectrum, well, maybe on the far left, perhaps, but not very many of those in Alberta, I would imagine. But for the majority of folks, the oil and gas is an integral part of the Alberta culture. And when that industry appears to be threatened, then regardless of their political views, they might vote in a particular way, or they might hold particular views on an issue. And I'm wondering if your data reflects that.
It does. I'll give you one example. When we ask people, do you think the oil and gas sector has too much influence over politics? Albertans have actually a very different view than the rest of Canadians, and actually are like polar opposites than those who live in Quebec, for example. Far fewer agree with that in Alberta than anywhere else. So that's just one example. But a friend of mine who's a professor at the University of Alberta, Dr. Jared Wesley, he did some focus groups in Alberta and asked people, I love this, draw an Albertan. And what he learned in focus groups right across the province, regardless of whether you were male or female, young or old, racialized or Caucasian or white, was you drew three things. You drew a roughneck, you drew a farmer, or you drew a rancher, right? And if you think about it, you did that exercise in BC and Ontario and Quebec, I don't think you'd get a consistent image, right? So the importance of oil and gas is central to the idea that Albertans, even if you don't work in the sector, even if you aren't from Alberta originally, has come to define it. So anything that threatens that identity, therefore, is a threat to you and your livelihood and your sense of identity in Alberta.
Now, you and I have had, in other interviews, we've talked about anxious progressives and anxious conservatives. These are folks who are feeling economic insecurity, and in the case of the anxious progressives, might actually, they hold very different views than the conservatives, but they share the anxiety and they share the susceptibility to populist ideas. And it seems to me that if there's any disruption that would affect Alberta more than anything else and create economic uncertainty and social uncertainty about the future, it is the energy transition. And that has accelerated in the last 3 years. We know since COVID and then the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And in this new world that we seem to be navigating, what have you noticed about the answers you're getting back in Alberta from those anxious conservatives and anxious progressives?
Well, first, in Alberta, there's almost, not quite, but almost double the number of anxious conservatives as there are in any other part of the country. So there's more of them in Alberta, which makes sense. There's that more conservative ideology. And so any anxiety is going to be, leaning towards the right as opposed to the left. But on that question of energy transition, it's really important, right? Because to so many people in Alberta, when they hear, and I know we're not going to get into debating the language, just transition or energy transition or clean energy transition, that is a bright, flashing red light that says you want to shut down an industry that either I work in, a family member works in, or a neighbor likely works in. And that's going to have a huge effect on our ability to, fund healthcare and education and keep the fact that we're the only jurisdiction in the country without a sales tax, right? Those are the so-called Alberta advantage. And so it's very threatening. I mean, it's simple as that. And you can try logically to explain the opportunities that exist in clean energy or the need to diversify, but there's going to be a core group who already feel incredibly anxious about their future and then come in and try to explain that the one thing that you feel secure about is your profession or the sector that you work in. And now you're going to tell me that within the next 20 years, we need to transition away from it. They're going to be even more defensive and resistant to any persuasion, any ideas that might move them into a place that accepts that it's going to happen.
Can you give us a sense of how dominant those people are in Alberta political culture? Are they 30%, 50%, 70% of voters? Are they mostly urban, or is it both urban and rural? What's your take?
So, that anxious conservative group broadly is about 34 to 40% of the electorate at any given moment. And they're more concentrated in the smaller towns and cities and rural communities in the province, but there's a sizable number of them in Calgary. Less so in Edmonton. I think Edmonton, you're more likely to find some anxious progressives than you are anxious conservatives. But there's this even smaller group that I think is fundamental to understanding the politics in the province right now, particularly as it pertains to Premier Smith and what she's trying to do. And it's about 15% of the electorate. And these are folks who right now say they would vote for the UCP, and they want the government in Alberta, when given a choice between fixing the roads and improving healthcare and getting the fundamentals right, or shaking things up and telling elites like Justin Trudeau to go to where, they want that shaking up. They want the kind of rattling of the cage. And that's 15% of the electorate. And when you look at what they believe, they love Danielle Smith. They hate Justin Trudeau. They weren't that keen about Jason Kenney in the final few months of his term. They like Donald Trump more than they like Rachel Notley, Justin Trudeau, or even Barack Obama. They love the Sovereignty Act. And really interesting, almost 7 in 10 believe that vaccine mandates are wrong and go against fundamental human rights. And only 1 in 4 think that climate change is something we should be serious about, right? So if you think that is the core of what probably helped elect Danielle Smith as leader, and is the energy in that party right now pushing her to say some things that a lot of Canadians and a lot of Albertans find offensive and strange, but that's the power source in the province right now. And they're the activists, they're the donors, they're the energy in the UCP movement, and in very much the same way, the Federal Conservative Party and their Alberta wing.
Now, back in 2015, 2016, I have friends and sort of colleagues in the United States, and some of them were supporting Trump at that time, and their message was very similar. Things are broken, and we're going to elect this guy to either fix it or burn it down and then rebuild it. And it's eerie how much that messaging now is being echoed in Canada. Everything's broken. Everything feels broken. What are we going to do about it? And so that group, that 15% that you're talking about, would seem to be particularly open to that message. And is Danielle Smith's strategy likely to be, I guess, in your opinion, to grow that group from 15% to 20 to 25%? Is that the strategy here?
I don't know. If it is, I don't think it's the winning strategy, because I don't think it's easy to convert enough people to hold those views over time, because I think there's a lot of people in that group aren't in the mainstream in terms of public opinion, even in Alberta. But what Danielle Smith is doing, and I think you see it in public opinion, is the one thing Albertans generally agree on, regardless of whether you're left, right, or center, is that Ottawa doesn't treat them fairly, right? And so this fight against, like, making Justin Trudeau enemy number one as opposed to Rachel Notley is a card that, you know, Alberta politicians, in fact, provincial politicians in many cases, have been using throughout Canadian history. But at this moment, where the polarization between how people that Justin Trudeau creates in Alberta is a very powerful tool for Danielle Smith. So I don't know if it's as much as she needs to convert people into her way of seeing the world, as opposed to, if they make the election and the choice that voters are going to be making it, who's going to fight for Alberta the hardest and push back against Justin Trudeau, who they are arguing wants to literally eliminate our core industry. Or you can go with Rachel Notley, who's basically a friend of Mr. Trudeau. That, I think, is a winning, potentially winning strategy for Danielle Smith, and I think that's what they truly believe.
Does your data suggest that they will be successful? That enough people are either enough people to either hold those views or are open to those views, that could be a winning strategy?
It could be. I mean, the structural nature of Alberta politics is that conservative parties have a natural advantage, right? They've won for almost 45, 50 years, with one exception when Rachel Notley won in 2015. But in my poll that I did in December, we identified a group of voters who voted for the UCP in the last provincial election, but today say they're either undecided or they're voting for another party. I'm calling them the reluctant UCPers. And what distinguishes this group from that 15%, for example, that I described earlier, that core of Danielle Smith's UCP base, is they are much more likely to care about healthcare. They think the healthcare system needs a lot of work. They want the fundamentals, of public policy solved, and aren't interested in rehashing and old fights over federalism and what role the federal and provincial government should play. They're not that excited about Danielle Smith. In fact, most of them think Jason Kenney was a better premier than she has been so far. But they are naturally conservative, right? They're going back to our original part of the conversation. They identify strongly with that Alberta that is an energy superpower. And so they are torn right now. And so the question about about who wins this election is whoever wins that segment of the electorate will likely win. There's a lot of them in Calgary, and Calgary is the battleground. So, I think we've seen evidence even just in the last day or two about Danielle Smith perhaps pivoting towards a more moderate position, where she even today said, I'm welcoming a conversation with the Prime Minister about the just transition, as opposed to fighting for it. I think perhaps she's recognizing it's an easier path for the UCP to win again if they at least appear more moderate on some of these issues than that kind of rabble rousing, let's just knock everybody down kind of approach.
I've made the argument in the past, David, that in Calgary in particular, it doesn't matter whether you're a center, maybe even center left and center right, in that sort of moderate part of the curve. You want to vote for an economic message. You vote your pocketbook, and you mentioned this earlier. And it seems like no party can win a majority of seats in Calgary unless they have part of their platform that addresses that issue. How are you going to create jobs? What are you going to do about our oil and gas sector? How are we going to, sustain that or protect it or whatever it is? But there has to be, a party has to have some clear message to voters, or the voters, they absolutely will vote. They'll vote for conservatives, who that is a big part of their message.
Right. It is, and I think you're right. In Calgary, it's particularly true. There's a sensitivity around perceptions around whether a government or a leader will be a threat to that core industry, right? Rachel Notley in 2015 won a number of seats in Calgary, but a lot of them were because of splits between the Wild Rose and the PC party at the time. Today, when you look at Calgary, it's basically evenly split between the two parties. And it's, I think, split because at the time we did that survey, and I think it would probably be true today, Danielle Smith looked like the less predictable, more perhaps government that would bring more instability to the province than stability. And you actually had Rachel Notley going to the Chamber of Commerce in Calgary and saying, I am the stable force in this province. I will, you'll know what you're going to get with me. There won't be chaos and massive changes. So I find that really interesting, right? That the Social Democrat in a province that is very conservative is positioning themselves as a stability. And I think that's reflective of maybe what Calgarians are looking for, right? Their natural inclination is generally not to support the New Democrats, but at a time when this new premier has been kind of a wrecking ball in terms of pushing over just common sense notions that people, I think, just took for granted, Rachel Notley doesn't look so radical anymore. And I think that's the question that's simmering in a lot of people's minds in Calgary.
Well, David, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Markham. Thanks.